Phuthela Modimo ka dula fatshe. O moruti ngombo le phuthego le makosa batho bohle ba kenetseng tshebeletso ena ke a le dumedisa ka lebitso le matla la morena le mopholosi wa rona e leng Jesu Kriste. Amen. Let us pray. Modimo ya matla ohle o seng ha letsatsi ke rona bana ha re tlile o manollana le lentswe lena la hao re tlile o mamedisana mmoho molaetsa wa kajeno lena re kopa Modimo ya matla ohle o lokise mantswe a molomo wa ka tsohle tse o kitlileng ho di bua e be tse hlonolofaditsweng ke wena bula dipelo tsa rona ho amohela seo lentswe le se buang re etsetse hona Modimo wa rona hobane rona tshepo ya rona e ho wena Modimo ya lokileng lefika la rona la ka mehla tsena re di kopa ka lebitso le matla la Jesu Kriste morena wa rona. Amen. Dia kutinda kutinwa aku Pila mandu Simba Misendese Pipagamese Friends, this morning we read two scriptures. The first one from the Old Testament by Prophet Zechariah. For those who were not here when we read that, it is found, we read chapter 9 from verse 9 to verse 13. And then we read the Gospel according to St. Luke chapter 1 from verse 46 to verse 55. Amen. Amen. Ni right? Ni right? Di right nam. Thank you, Mfundis, for this, for keeping our annual appointment. I hope you will remain faithful to our appointment even next year. Beku rough 2020. I beku rough. I thank God that you are still here. I thank God that through His grace we have made it thus far. If you think it is because it is of your wisdom and your strength and all that you are, that you have made it this far, allow me to say to you, then you know nothing. If you think you are here because of your own strength, because of your own wisdom, then you have not learned anything. So let me tell you, you are here because of God's grace. Remember that. You are here because of God's grace. Paul says, the grace of God is sufficient for all of us. Does not matter who you are. We are here because of God's grace. Those who are not here, do not think it is because God's grace was not sufficient for them. They are where they are because even in that, God's grace is sufficient for them. Those who have passed on, it is because God's grace was sufficient for them. Their time to meet their Creator had come. And so God's grace called them back home. So do not think those who have passed on, God's grace was not sufficient for them. Even for them, God's grace was sufficient. But I'm not there. Here we are. Today, this morning, I want us to reflect on the prophecy of Zechariah as we prepare ourselves for the arrival of the Messiah. As we prepare ourselves for the arrival of Jesus Christ, as we commemorate his birth this coming Friday. Christmas is on Friday, Mus. As we prepare ourselves for Christmas, as we prepare ourselves to commemorate the arrival of the Messiah, I want us to reflect on what is said in this prophecy of Zechariah in chapter 12, particularly verse 9. And I'll get to that. Zechariah is one of those prophets who in his prophecy addresses the post-exilic Jews who were now living in Judah. So he's speaking to people who have come back from exile in Babylon and find themselves having returned to the land that God once liberated their forefathers from Egypt and had given to them as theirs to occupy. A people who had been liberated, who had been set free after Cyrus defeated the Babylonians and set the Israelites free and send them back home. He writes his prophecy to a community at a brink of disintegration because some of the returnees were born in exile and therefore did not know the fundamental principles that had kept their forefathers in the land of Judah and of Jerusalem. And so because some of these people who had come from Babylon, who were not born in Judah or in Israel, did not know some of the teachings of their forefathers, did not really understand what it meant to live in the land that God had promised his people. And so Zechariah writes to rebuke them because they were carrying on as people who were not in a covenant with God. Because they were carrying on as people who had forgotten that God had said to them, you will be my people and I will be your God. And they were going on as if they were not in a relationship with God. The prophecy is written to address the Jews, to remind them that they had a sacred responsibility of rebuilding the temple. And therefore, the Jews who had returned from Babylon were sitting and living in Judah and in all other places and went on as if they had forgotten that they had the responsibility to rebuild the temple, which was a place of encountering with God. The problem with the returnees is that some of them did not remember the value and the importance of the temple in their lives. Hence, Prophet Haggai in chapter 2 verse 3 asks the question, who is left amongst you that saw this house in its former glory? Because they had forgotten, because they had just continued living their lives as if they did not have a responsibility. Just like many of us forget. Just like many of us forget that when we are not in the temple, when we are not in the church, we forget the value of worshiping. See, people forget. People forget. The very Israelites who have now come back have, by the history of the people, and so he reminds people, do not forget where you have come from with God. Do not forget what God has done for you. Because when you forget what God has done for you, you have a tendency then to walk away from God's grace. And I think I've said this before. I think I've said it here before. From this, I struggle with people who find Jesus. I struggle with people who find Jesus. A person comes to Central, to this church, and then Reverend Ngombo does something that upsets them, and then they leave. And then they go to another church. Remember, I've shared this with you. And when they get to that church, they find Jesus there. And then the pastor does something that upsets them, and then they leave. And they go to another church, and they find Jesus there. As if Jesus ever gets lost and needs to be found, when it is us who walk away from his grace. And so, when you leave, please do not leave to find Jesus elsewhere. Because Jesus is in the very same place you are living. Seven? So stop leaving and looking for Jesus everywhere. He is where you are leaving him. In actual fact, what you are doing is you are actually walking away from God's grace. Zechariah. I'll get to chapter 9. Zechariah. It is said that his name means Yahweh remembers. The Lord remembers. That is what the name of Zechariah means. The Lord remembers. The Lord remembers his people. The Lord remembers the promises he makes to his people. The Lord never forgets what he says when he says, I will bless you, and I will bless your children, and I will bless your children's children, and I will bless all generations that come after you. God never forgets. You might experience difficulties in life, but God never forgets. You might experience the most horrible time in your life, but God never forgets. He never forgets where you are. He never forgets the promises he made to you, because ours is a God who remembers. So even if life is tough, please do not forget God remembers. And at the right moment, Isaiah says, his ear is not too deaf to hear. His hand is not too short to get to you. Because he's a God who remembers. He remembers. If you do not believe me, go and ask Noah. After the rains had come down for 40 days and 40 nights, and the entire universe and the entire world was covered with water, it says in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, then God remembered Noah. When you think everything has collapsed, God remembers you. And so I want to say to you, do not rush to give up on this God, because he will remember you. Oh, you should hear a person who has been remembered by God. When he rises up from the ashes and looks at their own life, and as they walk the streets and encounter people who know them, you see, people will remind you of where you have come from. Remember that boy